Welcome to Muzi Horror World, and hello to tonight's terrifying tale. If you're ready to dive into the supernatural world, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss any of our spine-chilling stories. We have a lot more eerie tales coming your way, and trust me, you won't want to miss a single one. If you enjoyed our ghostly tales, please make sure to like this video because it helps us bring more creepy content to you. And as always, we love hearing from you. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. So, sit back, take a deep breath, and prepare yourself for tonight's haunting story, because what's about to happen, you won't believe. Story number 1. Have you ever heard a sound that sent chills down your spine, so unsettling that it echoed through your soul? Imagine hearing a bell ring, not just any bell, but one that's been cracked for decades. Its broken voice a constant reminder of the past. But here's the twist. It rings when no one is near, at odd hours, in places where no bell should be heard. And when it rings, something shifts. The air grows heavier, the shadows stretch longer, and whispers echo in the silence. What if this bell isn't ringing of its own accord? What if it's calling to something or someone? Something dark, ancient, and restless that lingers just beyond our understanding? But here's the real question. What happens when you're the one who answers its call? In the small, sleepy town of Bellwood, a strange relic rests in the old church at the edge of town, the cracked bell. Its story is whispered from one generation to the next, a legend passed down by the elders who still remember the days when it rang with purpose. But now, the bell no longer serves its original function. The cracks that mar its surface have grown wider with each passing year, and its once clear tone has turned into something far more sinister. No one knows why the bell rings on its own, or what it means. Some say it's a warning, a signal from the past that refuses to stay buried. Others believe it's the soul of the bell's maker, cursed and bound to the bell forever, restless and longing for release. But whatever the reason, the bell's eerie chimes have been heard by anyone brave enough to venture near the church at night, and those who have never come back the same. And one night, as the air thickens with an unnatural stillness, a young woman named Eleanor, unaware of the bell's true power, steps into the church, unknowingly crossing the threshold into the bell's mysterious world. She had heard the stories, but never believed them. That night, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. In the small town of Bellwood, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, stood an old church that had been abandoned for years. Its once proud structure was now crumbling, its roof sagging with time. But despite the church's dilapidation, there was one thing that kept the townspeople talking: the bell in the tower. It wasn't just any bell. It had a long history, one that most people preferred not to speak about. The bell was cracked, a large, jagged split running across its side. But it wasn't just its appearance that gave the bell its reputation. It was the way it rang. Or, more accurately, the way it rang when no one was around. For years, the bell had been silent. It was supposed to toll every hour, a signal to the townspeople to mark the time. But as the years passed, the bell had become a mere relic, forgotten by all but the elders who still remembered its chimes. No one thought much of it until the strange occurrences began. It started with whispers, townsfolk speaking in hushed tones about the bell ringing in the dead of night. The bell, which had long been dormant, began tolling on its own. But it wasn't just any ringing. It was deep, eerie, and unsettling, with a resonance that seemed to reverberate through the very bones of the town. At first, people thought it was some sort of trick. Perhaps the wind had been strong enough to move it, or maybe there was a simple mechanical malfunction. But as the weeks turned into months, the bell's mysterious ringing grew more frequent. Sometimes it rang twice a night. Other times, it rang at odd hours, waking the entire town with its haunting sound. And it was always the same, an eerie, low toll that seemed to echo deep into the night. One particularly quiet evening, as a fog crept in from the surrounding woods, Eleanor, a young woman who had lived in Bellwood her whole life, found herself walking past the church. She had heard the stories of the bell ringing at night, but she had always dismissed them as superstition. She was a practical woman, after all. The church had been abandoned for years. It was nothing more than an old, rotting building with no real purpose left. But as she approached the church that night, something felt different. The air was thick with tension, and the fog seemed to cling to her like a heavy blanket. She stopped in front of the church doors, looking up at the bell tower. For a brief moment, the town was completely silent. Not even the usual rustling of leaves in the wind could be heard. Then, suddenly, the bell rang. The sound was not what she had expected. It was deep and haunting, a sound that shook her to her very core. She stood frozen, staring at the tower, her heart pounding in her chest. The bell's sound resonated through the fog, sending a shiver down her spine. It rang again, louder this time, as if calling to her. She took a step back, but her curiosity pulled her closer. Despite every instinct telling her to turn around, Eleanor pushed open the church doors and stepped inside. The interior was dark and cold, the air stale and heavy. The faintest light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting eerie shadows across the pews. The bell had stopped ringing, but its sound still echoed in her mind, ringing in her ears like a constant, unsettling hum. Eleanor moved deeper into the church, her footsteps echoing through the vast emptiness. She reached the back, where a small set of stairs led up to the bell tower. Without thinking, she began to ascend, each step creaking beneath her weight. As she reached the top, she stood before the bell, its cracked surface looming over her. The bell was silent, but something in the air felt wrong, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. Then, without warning, the bell rang again. The sound was deafening now, so loud that it seemed to reverberate in her very soul. She covered her ears, but it didn't help. The ringing only grew louder, more insistent, as if it was demanding her attention. Eleanor felt a strange pull, an irresistible force drawing her closer to the bell. And then, she saw it. Out of the corner of her eye, a shadow moved in the darkness of the church. It was just a flicker, a brief glimpse of something she couldn't fully comprehend. But it was enough. Her heart began to race, and her instinct screamed for her to run. But she couldn't. She couldn't move. It was as though the bell had frozen her in place, trapping her in its powerful grasp. The shadow moved closer, and Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she turned toward it. What she saw nearly stopped her heart. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was a figure, a tall, dark shape that seemed to shimmer in and out of existence, like a mirage. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were hollow pits, and its mouth stretched into a grin that seemed far too wide for any normal human face. Eleanor tried to scream, but no sound came out. She could only watch as the figure stepped toward her, the sound of the bell growing louder with each step it took. The bell rang again, a low, guttural toll that seemed to shake the very foundation of the church. The figure stopped just in front of her, its cold breath brushing against her skin. It whispered her name, a voice that sounded like 1,000 voices whispering at once. Eleanor. Her blood ran cold. She had to get out, but her legs wouldn't move. She was trapped in the grip of the bell's curse. With a final, deafening ring, The figure lunged forward, its hands reaching for her. But just as it made contact, the bell rang one last time, and everything went dark. Story number 2. Imagine stumbling upon an old, dust-covered box hidden deep in the attic of a house you've just moved into. It's small, unassuming, but there's something about it, something that calls to you. It's locked, yet it seems to pulse with an energy you can't ignore. You think to yourself, it's just a box. It's probably empty, or maybe filled with old trinkets from the past. But as you draw closer, a whisper escapes from the cracks in the wood, sending a chill down your spine. A voice, soft and coaxing, murmurs in a language you don't recognize, but you understand its meaning. Open me. And with those words, everything begins to change. What would you do? Ignore the whisper, turn away, and leave the box untouched, or give in to temptation? Open the box and let the whispers inside take over. Sometimes, the things we're most curious about can be the most dangerous. But what if this box wasn't just any ordinary box? What if it was a box of secrets, a cursed relic that promises to reveal things you never should have known? As you feel the temptation swirling, drawing you closer, you begin to wonder, what's in the box? And more importantly, why does it whisper to you? Once you open it, there's no going back. You've crossed a threshold, and what lies inside might change your life or end it forever. Stay with me, because this is the story of the box of secrets, where curiosity is far more than just a harmless trait, and sometimes the things we discover can be our undoing. Welcome to another chilling tale that will leave you questioning everything around you. What would happen if a box suddenly appeared in your life, whispering secrets too tempting to resist? The kind of whispers that draw you in, promising knowledge or power, but with a price you never expected to pay. In this story, the box isn't just an object, it's a trap, one that feeds on your darkest desires and holds the secrets of the past in a way that no one should ever uncover. Clara had always been a curious soul, someone who liked to explore old places, uncover hidden treasures, and discover stories left behind in forgotten corners. When she moved into her new apartment, an old, creaky building on the edge of town, she had hoped it would mark the beginning of a fresh start. The walls were thick with history, and the musty smell of age hung in the air, but it felt like home. There was a charm to the place, despite the faded wallpaper and squeaky floors. It wasn't until one late evening, as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, casting long shadows across her cluttered attic, that Clara discovered the box. She had been rummaging through old belongings, some of which were left behind by the previous tenants. Most of it was junk, but something caught her eye in the far corner of the attic. A small, wooden box tucked away beneath a pile of yellowed newspapers. At first, Clara thought it was just another forgotten trinket, perhaps something old and worthless. But when she touched it, she felt a chill race through her spine. The box was cold to the touch, unnaturally so, as if it had been preserved in ice for years. Its surface was smooth, almost too smooth, as though time had polished it. Intricate carvings adorned the box, strange symbols that seemed to swirl and shift when she looked at them from different angles. Clara tried to ignore the uneasy feeling that crept over her, but found herself drawn to it, unable to resist. As she lifted the box, she noticed that there was no key, no latch, just a small, almost imperceptible seam where the lid should open. She hesitated. There was something in the air now, a strange pressure, as though the room itself was holding its breath. The silence was absolute, save for the faint creaking of the wooden beams above her. Then it came, a whisper, so soft, She thought it might be the wind. She glanced around the room, but there was no one there. Yet, the whisper persisted, a voice as faint as a shadow. "Open me." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself it was just her imagination, but the voice grew louder, clearer. "Open me, and all will be revealed. Your desires, your questions, everything, all of it." The air grew colder, and Clara's hand trembled as it hovered over the box. Her logical mind screamed for her to stop, to leave it alone. Yet, she couldn't pull herself away. The voice was like a lure, irresistible, a temptation she couldn't shake. With a deep, shaky breath, Clara searched the attic for anything that could open the box. Her fingers brushed against a forgotten key hanging from an old, rusted nail in the corner. The key was simple, unremarkable, but it fit perfectly into the lock. She hesitated for a moment longer before turning the key, her fingers now slick with sweat. The lid creaked open. As soon as it did, a sharp gust of wind swept through the room, slamming the attic door shut. Clara stumbled back, eyes wide in shock. The whisper had stopped, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. Inside the box was a single, rolled-up scroll, tied with a crimson ribbon. The paper was aged and brittle, the color of ivory, and it shimmered faintly under the dim light. A shiver ran down Clara's spine as she reached for the scroll. The moment her fingers brushed the ribbon, the voice returned, but this time it was louder, clearer, more insistent. It echoed in her mind, almost like it was inside her thoughts. "Open it. You must." The voice was no longer seductive but demanding. Clara could feel the weight of something heavy pressing against her chest. She unrolled the scroll, revealing a strange series of symbols. They were ancient, unfamiliar, their shapes almost alien. Each symbol seemed to move on its own, shifting and changing as though they had a life of their own. Beneath the symbols, a short message was written in a fine, flowing script. "The price for knowledge is more than you can afford. To learn the secrets, you must lose something of yourself." Clara's hands shook as she read the words. She felt her heartbeat quicken, panic beginning to set in. The voice had stopped whispering, but now a deep, bone-chilling cold surrounded her, seeping into her bones. She turned the scroll over, desperate for more, but there was nothing, only a lingering, haunting silence. She tried to leave the attic, but the door wouldn't budge. No matter how hard she pulled, it remained shut, as if something invisible was holding it in place. The air felt thick with pressure, as though someone, was watching her. The whispering voice returned, now louder than ever, rattling her mind, filling her thoughts. "You've opened the box. You've accepted the price. There is no turning back." Clara backed away from the box, her heart racing. She had to get out. She had to escape. But as she turned to look for an exit, she saw it. The symbols from the scroll had appeared on the walls, carved into the wooden beams. They glowed with an eerie light, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. The room seemed to close in on her. The box was no longer just a box. It was alive, feeding off her fear, growing stronger with each passing second. She tried to destroy it, to throw it away, but the box was far more powerful than she had imagined. It was as if it had claimed her, body, mind, and soul. Days passed, and Clara could no longer tell where the real world ended and the whispers began. She heard the voice even in her sleep, urging her to open the box once more. Each time she resisted, the whispers grew more insistent, more desperate. The box had found her, and it would never let her go. She warned others, told them of the box and its dangers, but no one believed her. They thought she was mad. The box had already claimed her. It was only a matter of time before it would claim them too. And so, the box remains, waiting, locked and hidden. Its whispers reaching out to those who dare to listen. It calls to the curious, the desperate, the lost. But once the box is opened, there is no turning back. The price is always too high. The box of secrets, its temptations are eternal. Story number 3. Imagine finding an old, rusty key tucked away in the deepest corner of your home. It's not like any key you've ever seen. Its iron surface worn and weathered by time. But something about it pulls you in, calling you to find what it opens. It feels as though it's been waiting for you, just for this moment. You're intrigued. You feel the need to discover its secret, to unlock whatever mystery it holds behind a door you've never seen. But here's the thing. What if the door it opens isn't a place, but a nightmare? A nightmare that traps anyone who dares to turn the key. You feel an unsettling chill as you hold the key, and a voice, soft and haunting, whispers through your mind. Open the door, if you dare, but you're no ordinary person. You've faced your fears before, and this is different. Or is it? The rusty key. What does it open, and why does it feel like it's been waiting for you, drawing you in like a moth to a flame? What's behind that door? What ancient horror lurks behind it, waiting to emerge when you unlock it? It's a door to terror that no one should dare open, yet it beckons to those who are curious enough to turn the key. And so, you stand there, holding the key in your trembling hands, unable to shake the feeling that once you unlock it, your life will never be the same again. That something, no, someone, is waiting for you on the other side, watching, following you, lurking in the shadows. Would you dare to turn it? Would you open the door to your worst nightmare? Let's find out. It was late one evening and Emma, an inquisitive young woman, was going through the attic of her late grandmother's house. The attic, a forgotten corner of the house, was full of relics, dust, and old trunks that held memories long buried. She had come to the house to settle the last of her grandmother's affairs, but there was one thing that always intrigued her, the mystery surrounding her grandmother's old belongings. Her grandmother had been a quiet, reclusive woman, and there were strange rumors about the house that Emma had always brushed off as mere superstition. As she dug deeper into the boxes, a small, tarnished object caught her eye. It was a key, a rusty, old iron key, its edges worn and jagged. The key didn't seem like much at first, just another trinket lost in time. But when Emma picked it up, she felt an odd sensation wash over her, a shiver, like the feeling you get when you're being watched. The key seemed to hum with a strange energy, as though it had a purpose beyond what she could comprehend. But what really puzzled Emma was the engraving on the key. It wasn't just a random pattern. It was a twisted, intricate symbol, one that seemed to squirm and change if you looked at it too long. She'd never seen anything like it, and it piqued her curiosity even more. "Where does it fit?" she muttered to herself. She searched the attic, opening drawers and cupboards, hoping to find a lock that matched the mysterious key. But nothing. She spent hours rummaging through the attic, but the key seemed to be an enigma, with no obvious use. As night fell, she decided to call it a day. But something inside her urged her to keep going. This key felt important, as if it was meant for something. The very next evening, Emma decided to go back to the house. The weather had turned colder, the wind howling against the windows as if to warn her. But her mind was made up. She knew she had to find where the key belonged, or the mystery would drive her mad. That night, She focused on one part of the house she hadn't dared venture into before, the cellar. Her grandmother had always kept the cellar locked, and Emma had never been allowed to go down there. The door was old and uninviting, hidden behind layers of cobwebs and forgotten tools. Emma's heart raced as she approached the door, the key tight in her hand. She took a deep breath and inserted the key into the lock. As she turned the key, a strange feeling washed over her, as though something was stirring on the other side of the door. The lock clicked, but as it did, a cold gust of wind poured through the cracks in the door, sending a shiver down her spine. Hesitant but determined, Emma slowly pushed open the door, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence of the house. The cellar was pitch dark. The air smelled damp and stale, like old earth and forgotten places. She flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. The darkness was thick, swallowing everything in sight. Emma hesitated, her breath shallow, but the urge to explore was too strong. She took one step inside, then another, the soft crunch of dust underfoot the only sound that broke the silence. As she ventured deeper into the cellar, she noticed something strange. Old, broken furniture, stacks of boxes, and shelves filled with jars and bottles. But there was something else, something far more unsettling. There, in the far corner of the room, stood a large wooden door, different from the others. It was older, thicker, and it seemed to radiate a strange energy. Her heart raced as she moved toward it, and she noticed that the door had no handle, only a keyhole. The key. It was as if this door had been waiting for her all along. Emma didn't even hesitate as she slid the rusty key into the lock and turned it. This time, the sound of the lock clicking echoed through the cellar like a death knell. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase leading down into total darkness. Emma felt a chill crawl up her spine. It was as if the entire house was holding its breath, waiting for her to make the next move. She stepped forward, and as soon as she did, the door slammed shut behind her with a force that rattled the walls. She whipped around, but it was too late. The darkness ahead seemed to shift, moving like a living thing, alive with something ancient and malevolent. With every step she took, the temperature dropped. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and the sound of her footsteps seemed muffled, swallowed by the oppressive air. As she descended further, the feeling of dread grew stronger. Her legs felt heavy, as if something was trying to pull her back, to stop her from going deeper. But she couldn't turn back now. Something inside her, something she couldn't explain, drove her forward. The stairs led to a vast underground chamber, the walls lined with old symbols and strange markings, as though the very earth itself had been carved by dark hands. And in the center of the room stood a tall, ominous figure. Its back to her, cloaked in shadow. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as the figure slowly turned to face her. Its face was obscured by a dark hood, but Emma could feel its eyes on her, piercing through the darkness like 1,000 sharp blades. "You shouldn't have come," the figure whispered, its voice like the crackling of dry leaves. Emma took a step back, but her feet felt glued to the floor. Her body refused to obey, as though she were rooted to the spot. The air in the room grew thick, heavy, suffocating. She gasped for breath, but it felt like there was no air left. The figure stepped closer, its voice now a low, eerie hum. "The key! It was never meant for you," it murmured. "But now that you've opened the door, you cannot leave." The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pulsating with a dark energy. The figure's form began to warp, its body twisting and elongating, the shadows spilling out like ink in water. Emma's pulse raced, her mind screaming at her to run, but her body refused to move. "You belong here now," the figure whispered, its mouth forming a grin of jagged teeth. "The key has chosen you." The last thing Emma saw before everything went black was the twisted, grinning face of the creature, its eyes glowing with an unearthly light. And then, silence. Cold, oppressive silence. The next morning, when the house was found in a state of eerie stillness, no one ever discovered Emma again. The key, now lying in the corner of the cellar, was the only thing that remained, its twisted symbol glinting in the dim light, as if waiting for the next victim to come. And so, the key waits, its rusted edges gleaming in the dark, as it beckons to the curious, the brave, and the foolish alike. Story number 4. Have you ever wondered what would happen if a simple object could unravel your deepest fears? Imagine holding something as harmless as a compass, only to find that it doesn't point north, or to any place you recognize, but instead, it points somewhere much darker, somewhere terrifying. What if every direction it guided you in was towards your greatest nightmare? A place where your worst fears became all too real, and there was no turning back. Now, picture yourself standing in the middle of a dense, silent forest, your hand trembling as it grips this broken compass. You see it spin uncontrollably, the needle dancing with a life of its own. It doesn't lead you to safety, to a clear path. No, it leads you deeper into the unknown. And no matter how hard you try, you can't shake the feeling that whatever it points to, you're meant to find. What would you do if every step you took felt like you were walking toward the very thing you feared most? The broken compass isn't just an object. It's a curse, a symbol of fate twisting itself into your nightmares, pulling you toward the terrifying, the unknown, and the unimaginable. Each twist of the compass brings you closer to a horror that only you can truly understand. But the real question is, can you escape its pull? Or will the compass lead you to face your fears head-on? Welcome to a journey like no other, where a simple tool can unlock the deepest, most terrifying corners of your mind. Today, we'll explore the story of a man who stumbled upon a broken compass, an innocent relic that would soon lead him down a path filled with his own worst nightmares. And once it began, there was no going back. Jason had always been drawn to the strange and unexplained. An avid explorer of forgotten places, he often found himself digging through antique stores, searching for relics with hidden histories. One day, he came across an old, dusty shop at the end of an alley, the kind that seemed to have materialized out of time. There, on a forgotten shelf, he found a small brass compass. It looked worn and ancient, with intricate engravings on its casing and a needle that seemed slightly too erratic for its purpose. The shopkeeper, a frail old man, had warned him about the compass in a whispering voice. "It leads to where you don't want to go," he had muttered. But Jason, dismissing the warning as superstition, bought it for a few dollars. He had no idea that this small, innocuous object would soon alter the course of his life. Jason wasn't particularly superstitious. He knew the value of navigation tools for his hiking trips, and he'd found himself getting lost more than once. A good compass was a necessity, especially on longer journeys in the wilderness. So, the next weekend, he packed his gear for a solo hike in the dense woods north of town. The air was crisp, and the day had started off clear. But something felt off when he reached the edge of the forest. The trees towered above him, their shadows stretching unnaturally long as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The compass, still in its case, sat in his pocket, its strange weight a constant reminder of the warnings he had dismissed. At first, the compass seemed perfectly fine. He used it to navigate through the trees, the needle pointing steadily north as he moved deeper into the forest. But as the day wore on, the air around him began to grow thick and heavy, and a deep unease settled in his stomach. Every so often, he would glance at the compass, only to notice that the needle was wavering, not pointing true north anymore, but rather shifting erratically. Curious and slightly unnerved, Jason stopped to examine the compass more closely. As he held it in his hand, the needle jerked violently to the left, then swung in the opposite direction. The brass casing felt cold against his palm, and the metal seemed to hum with an energy that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He tried to ignore it, dismissing it as a malfunction or his own paranoia, but the feeling of being watched lingered in the air. The further Jason walked, the more intense the strange feeling grew. The trees around him appeared to move, their branches swaying in unnatural rhythms. The whisper of the wind grew louder, though there was no breeze. He could hear footsteps behind him, too faint to pinpoint, but unmistakably there. Turning around, he saw nothing, just the dense forest, its shadows stretching and shifting like living things. His heart began to race. This wasn't just any hike. He was in the grip of something ancient, something beyond his understanding. The compass, still trembling in his hand, seemed to be pulling him forward, urging him deeper into the forest. He tried to turn back, but the path behind him had vanished. The trees had closed in, blocking his retreat. Panic began to rise in his chest. The compass pointed relentlessly in one direction, east. No matter how he adjusted it, no matter how much he tried to make sense of it, the needle wouldn't budge. It was as if the compass was no longer a guide but a controller, pushing him forward, deeper into the heart of the forest. Jason stumbled through the thick underbrush, his steps frantic. The air was now dense, suffocating, as though the forest itself was pressing in on him. The light seemed to dim further with every step. The sounds of nature had disappeared entirely. Even the birds and insects, so present just moments ago, had fallen silent. The world around him felt empty, as though it had ceased to exist beyond the confines of this cursed forest. Then, as he rounded a bend in the trees, he saw something ahead of him that made his blood run cold. A clearing. It wasn't just any clearing, but one that felt unnatural, wrong. The ground was marked with deep, old scars, as if something had been buried there long ago. At the center of the clearing was a large stone structure, crumbling with age, its stones covered in strange markings. And in the center of the structure, there was a circle, an ancient, unbroken circle, made of old, brittle bones. The compass seemed to pulse in his hand, the needle spinning wildly as if it were alive. Jason stood frozen, unable to move. There was a pull in the air, an invisible force drawing him forward. His legs moved of their own accord, despite his mind screaming at him to stop, to turn back. He could feel the cold sweat on his skin as he walked into the center of the clearing, the bones crunching underfoot. As he approached the stone structure, he saw it, a figure, barely visible, standing in the shadows. It was tall, with a cloak made of darkness, its face hidden beneath a hood. Jason's heart pounded in his chest, his breath quickening. The air was thick with a dark presence, and he could feel his body trembling with fear. The compass slipped from his hand, falling to the ground with a dull thud. The needle stopped spinning, its eerie twitching finally ceasing. The figure before him took a slow step forward, and Jason could feel his mind unraveling. The air around him was thick with dread, the feeling of being trapped, of being unable to escape from something far older than the forest itself. The figure's voice filled his ears, though its lips never moved. It was everywhere, in his head, in his bones. You sought the path, it whispered, and now the path leads only to your greatest fear. Jason felt his legs buckle beneath him, his vision blurred, the world around him distorting. The shadows seemed to take shape, twisting and writhing, feeding off his fear. The figure was now directly in front of him, its hooded face still hidden, but Jason could feel it watching him, watching, waiting. He tried to scream, but no sound came. His body was frozen, his fear consuming him. As the reality of his situation settled in, the compass, the force that had guided him here, had not just led him to this place. It had led him to his doom. There was no escape now. The clearing closed in on him, the shadows swallowing him whole. And as Jason's mind gave way to the terror that had been slowly consuming him, he knew he would never leave this place. The forest had claimed him, just as it had claimed others before him, and the compass would wait, waiting for the next soul to stumble upon its cursed needle, guiding them toward their own worst nightmare. The whispers in the dark were the only sound left as the forest settled into an oppressive silence. The compass remained on the ground, its needle pointing endlessly in one direction, into the heart of terror forever. Story number 5. Imagine finding an old journal, its leather cover worn with age, its pages yellowed with time. You open it, expecting to find someone's long-forgotten thoughts, only to discover that it begins to write on its own. The words spill out, as if some unseen hand is guiding the pen. What if this journal wasn't just a relic of the past, but a living, breathing thing that had its own stories to tell? But here's the twist. What if it started to write about you? Your life, your secrets, your fears, all laid bare on the pages, before you even had the chance to think them. And worst of all, what if it wouldn't stop? What if the journal started to write about things that hadn't happened yet? What if it began to predict your future? How far would you go to uncover the truth behind this endless journal? And would you be willing to face the consequences of knowing what was yet to come? In today's story, we're diving into a tale of mystery and suspense, where one curious soul discovers a journal that writes itself, and as the words flow, the line between reality and fiction begins to blur. Stick with us as we unravel the dark secrets of the endless journal, where the only certainty is that once you open it, there's no turning back. Have you ever wished you could see into the future? What if I told you that a simple journal, a relic of someone's past, could give you a glimpse into what lies ahead? It seems harmless at first, just an old book filled with empty pages. But what happens when those pages start to fill themselves? Imagine the fear of watching your own story unfold before your eyes, with every word writing itself and no way to stop it. Tonight, we'll uncover the eerie tale of a journal that refuses to stay closed, one that writes of the future, of fate, and of consequences no one could have imagined. This is the story of the Endless Journal. Keep watching, because this isn't just a story, it's a warning. Under the faint glow of a dying street lamp, Sarah stumbled across the abandoned house at the edge of town. It was a place people whispered about, but never dared approach. The house had always been locked up, a ruin of time, with its windows boarded up and its walls holding secrets no one wanted to uncover. Yet, tonight, Sarah felt drawn to it, as if someone, was calling her. Her curiosity had led her to this strange, desolate place, but it was the strange, weathered journal in her hand that seemed to demand her presence. She didn't remember how she found it. One moment, she was browsing through her grandmother's belongings, and the next, She found herself with this mysterious journal, its leather cover warm under her fingers despite the chill in the air. It didn't seem to belong to any era she could recognize. No title, no author, just a lock, as if it was meant to stay hidden from prying eyes. Inside, she saw nothing but empty pages, the kind that seemed to beg for something to be written upon them. What was it about this journal that beckoned her? A shiver ran through her, but she couldn't resist. She opened the book, her fingers trembling. The first words that came to her mind spilled onto the paper. "I feel lost." She stared at the words, almost as if they were written by someone else. Then, the pages seemed to shift under her eyes, as if the ink had somehow seeped into the pages before she even touched the pen. The next line appeared, almost taunting her. "You are not alone." A heavy silence fell over Sarah as she looked at the journal in her hands. The eerie words faded into the paper as if they were never written at all. Her heart began to pound as she could swear she had heard a whisper, soft and distant. She tried to shake it off, but a strange sensation seemed to grow in the pit of her stomach. Her breath caught when she saw the journal beginning to fill up by itself. It wasn't just words anymore. It was a story unfolding, a story about her. As Sarah read the new lines appearing in front of her, the world around her seemed to bend and shift. The story was describing everything she saw, everything she was doing, before she even did it. She tried to stop writing, but it was impossible. The journal wouldn't allow her. The ink spilled faster than she could process, the words revealing things about her deepest fears and her darkest thoughts. It spoke of things that had happened to her in the past, things she had never told a soul. It knew her, better than she knew herself. But the more she read, the more she felt a connection, an eerie bond with the book. It was almost as if the book was alive, breathing and pulsing with her own heartbeat. The journal didn't just write the present, it foretold the future. It described a room she had never been to, but when she looked up, she saw it in front of her. A room in the abandoned house she stood before. The door creaked open before she could even touch it, and inside, the words of the journal guided her. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the room seemed to be filled with shadows that twisted and turned as though they had a life of their own. The journal's voice now had a more sinister tone. The pages began to show her things she wished she hadn't seen. They described a grave she would visit one day, a figure who would stand over it. Her own reflection stared back at her from the book. No, it was something else, something darker, her eyes hollow and filled with despair. The journal's whispers became louder, as if it was no longer just a book but a voice in her head, a presence that invaded every corner of her mind. Sarah tried to put the journal down, but it wouldn't let her. No matter where she went, no matter how hard she tried to escape, it followed her. The room seemed endless now, the walls growing taller, the floor stretching beneath her feet. She turned around in a panic, but the door she had come through had disappeared, leaving her alone with only the journal. The whispers in her head grew frantic, urging her to write. Every word she penned only made the room grow darker, the air colder. The temperature dropped so sharply that she could see her breath in front of her. She could feel the journal pulling her deeper into its grip, its pages like fingers closing around her, dragging her into its written nightmare. The ink blurred before her eyes, and as she frantically scribbled on the pages in a desperate attempt to regain control, the book began to resist. It forced the words from her pen, faster and faster, until the ink became a swirling mass of shapes, twisting and writhing on the page. The journal had taken on a life of its own, a life that wouldn't let her go. Suddenly, the writing stopped. A single line appeared on the page. "You're part of the story now." The ground beneath her feet gave way. Sarah tumbled into the abyss, the journal still clutched in her hands. She fell through a void of endless pages, pages that seemed to stretch on forever. She could feel the weight of the words pushing her further down, as if the journal itself was a force of gravity, pulling her deeper into its endless story. As she fell, Sarah realized with horror that the journal wasn't just writing her fate. It was writing her into its own endless, looping tale. And no matter how much she tried to scream, no one would ever hear her. Her story would never end. The journal's ink bled into the darkness. Story number 6. Have you ever heard a sound that didn't seem to belong? Something so eerie, so out of place, that it sends a chill crawling down your spine? Picture this: a violin, sitting in an abandoned corner, untouched for years. Yet, when the room is empty, its strings begin to sing. A soft, haunting melody that seems to echo in the silence, filling the space with a chilling tune no one can explain. There's something unsettling about music, especially when it plays on its own. But what if the music wasn't just a random melody? What if it was trying to tell a story? A story from the past, a story hidden in the dark corners of time, waiting for someone to listen. And what if this violin, with its mysterious, ghostly music, held a secret so powerful that once you hear it, you can never escape? Imagine a room filled with silence, the air heavy and still. And then, just as you think you're alone, the soft, eerie sound of a violin begins to play, drawing you in with its mournful tune. No one is there, yet the melody continues, as though the strings are moved by invisible hands. The question lingers: who or what is playing this violin? And more importantly, why is it playing for you? As the music swells, you can't help but listen, but with each note, you feel yourself sinking deeper into a story you never intended to uncover. The violin's tune is no longer just a sound. It's a call, a beckoning from the shadows. And once you follow its melody, there's no turning back. Stay with me, and let's unravel the mystery behind the silent violin. A haunting tale that may just make you think twice the next time you hear an instrument play on its own. In the heart of the town stood an old mansion, long abandoned, with ivy creeping up its once grand facade. No one could remember the last time anyone had lived there. The windows were boarded up, the doors locked with rusted chains, and the once beautiful garden was now a tangle of weeds and overgrowth. Despite its desolation, there was something oddly alluring about the mansion, as if it were holding a secret, something that had been waiting for the right person to discover it. Among the many rumors about the house, one tale stood out. It was said that in one of the rooms, deep inside the mansion, there was a violin. Not just any violin, but a cursed one. The story went that the violin had been left behind by a renowned musician, a virtuoso who had disappeared without a trace one stormy night many years ago. No one knew exactly what had happened to him, but some believed the violin was to blame. They said that when the violin was played, eerie tunes filled the air, tunes that could drive anyone to madness, pulling them into a trance, never to return. People had heard strange stories, whispers of music wafting through the air on moonlit nights, chilling and ethereal, as if the violin was playing itself. The villagers avoided the mansion, keeping their distance, too afraid to go near. But as with all forbidden things, curiosity began to gnaw at the bravest souls. The story of the haunted violin became too tempting to resist for one young man, a man known for his skepticism, his refusal to believe in the supernatural. His name was Ethan. He had heard the stories, of course, but he was not one to give in to fear or superstition. To him, the idea of a haunted violin was nothing more than a folk tale, a story told to scare children. But deep down, the mystery called to him, urging him to uncover the truth. He decided that he would be the one to step inside the mansion, to find the violin and prove to the world that there was no such thing as ghosts or curses. One chilly evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the moon began to rise, Ethan made his way to the mansion. The air was thick with fog, and the streets were deserted. As he approached the old house, the creaking of the gates sounded louder than usual, almost as if the house itself was aware of his presence. The mansion loomed in front of him, its dark windows staring down like eyes in the night. Ethan wasn't afraid. He had come prepared with a flashlight and a sturdy rope, just in case he needed to climb to the upper floors. As he stepped inside, the smell of mildew and decay hit him, but he pressed forward, undeterred. The mansion felt oddly cold, the kind of cold that made his skin prickle, but he refused to turn back. He moved from room to room, each one more dilapidated than the last. Dust-covered furniture, broken glass, and faded portraits lined the walls. The mansion had clearly been abandoned for decades, but as he ventured deeper into the house, a strange sensation began to creep up his spine. It was subtle at first, like a chill in the air that couldn't quite be explained. But it grew stronger as he climbed the stairs to the second floor, where the violin was said to be kept. The room he entered was small, almost hidden away, with a single window letting in a faint light from the moon. It was in the corner of this room that the violin sat, perched atop an old wooden stand. The moment Ethan laid eyes on it, his breath caught in his throat. The violin seemed to shimmer in the dim light, as if beckoning him to come closer. The strings were old and worn, but the wood itself looked polished, almost new. Without hesitation, Ethan approached the violin. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he reached out to touch it. The moment his fingers brushed the wood, a strange energy coursed through him. It was as if the violin had a life of its own, a presence that demanded attention. And then, without warning, the room fell silent. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, the violin began to play. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, like a whisper in the air. But soon, the melody grew louder, clear as day, and it was unlike anything Ethan had ever heard. It was haunting, melancholic, and strangely beautiful. Yet there was an underlying sense of dread that made his skin crawl. The music seemed to vibrate in the very air around him, pulling him in, urging him to listen more closely. Ethan tried to move, but he found that his legs wouldn't obey him. The music was like a spell, locking him in place, forcing him to hear every note, every eerie trill. He could feel the music seeping into his bones, filling his mind with strange visions. Visions of dark figures moving in the shadows, eyes glowing in the dark, hands reaching out to grab him. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. His vision began to blur, the room spinning around him. The violin's song became more frantic, more desperate, as though it was trying to pull him into the depths of its haunting melody. He struggled, his body stiff and unresponsive, unable to break free from the grip the violin had on him. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The music ceased as quickly as it had begun. The room fell into a deathly silence, but the damage had already been done. Ethan's heart raced, his breathing shallow and quick. He felt as if something had been ripped from him, like a part of his soul had been taken. He stumbled backward, his eyes darting around the room in a panic. The violin, now still and silent, seemed to be watching him. It wasn't until he turned to leave the room that he realized something was terribly wrong. The mansion had changed. The walls seemed to close in around him, and the hallways stretched impossibly long. The front door, once so clearly visible, was nowhere to be seen. It was as if the house itself had shifted, trapping him inside. Ethan wandered the mansion for hours, his mind growing more frantic with each passing minute. No matter which way he turned, he could never find the door. The music from the violin still echoed in his mind, like a phantom in the back of his thoughts. It wasn't long before his body grew weak, his legs trembling, his mind losing its grip on reality. The house was alive, and it was hunting him. Days later, when the villagers came searching for him, they found nothing but the violin, resting silently on its stand, untouched, waiting for the next person to succumb to its eerie song. Ethan was never seen again, and so the mansion and its haunted violin remained, a place where the music never truly stopped, and those who listened were forever lost. The house waited, its doors forever closed to the world, but the violin would always play, calling out to the next curious soul who dared to enter its cursed walls. Story number 7. Have you ever come across an object so old, so mysterious, that it seemed to call out to you from the depths of history? Imagine finding something abandoned, hidden away for years, only to discover it holds more power than you could ever comprehend. This story is about one such object, a mask forgotten by time, yet filled with an ancient and dark energy. A mask that, when worn, transforms the very soul of the person who dares to put it on. But it isn't just any mask. It is a mask that takes what is good and twists it into something evil. A mask that doesn't just change your appearance, but changes the very core of who you are. It was said to have been crafted by a secret society long ago. Men and women who were obsessed with the darker side of power and the things that lurk in the shadows. They believed that whoever wore the mask would gain unimaginable strength and influence, but at a terrible cost. As centuries passed, the mask was lost to history, its origins buried beneath layers of dust and folklore. But like all things with such dark power, it was never truly forgotten. It waited, hidden in the darkest corners, waiting for the right person to find it. And one day, someone did. A young man, unaware of the mask's history, came across it. Intrigued by its beauty and the strange pull it had, he couldn't resist. Little did he know that the moment he touched the mask, his life would change forever. But this wasn't the kind of change anyone could come back from. This was a transformation that would take him down a path from which there was no return. What would happen to him once the mask was on? And, more importantly, would he ever be the same again? Stay with me as we uncover the true horror behind the forgotten mask. It was a rainy afternoon when David stumbled upon the small antique shop. He had just moved to the quiet town of Marlow, seeking solitude and escape from the painful memories that clung to him. The small town, with its cobblestone streets and weathered buildings, seemed like the perfect place to begin anew. As he wandered through the unfamiliar streets, an old shop caught his attention. Its windows were foggy, and a sign hung above the door that read, "Curiosities of the Past." Intrigued, David stepped inside, his boots scraping against the wooden floorboards. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic, as if the past itself lingered in every corner. The shop was cluttered with trinkets, clocks, and strange artifacts, each one whispering tales of bygone eras. But there was one item that seemed to stand out, even in this bizarre collection: a mask. It sat on a dusty shelf, overshadowed by a collection of antique mirrors and tarnished silver. The mask was strange, ornate, and covered in intricate engravings. It was shaped to resemble a face, but its expression was emotionless. Blank, hollow eyes, a curved smile that didn't quite belong. The mask was crafted from bronze, tarnished with age, and had an eerie, unsettling presence. Its surface was smooth, but the markings etched into it appeared ancient, almost like they had been carved by hands long forgotten. David's curiosity got the better of him, and he asked the shopkeeper about the mask. The old man's face instantly tightened, his eyes darkening. "That mask is best left alone," he muttered, his voice gravelly and low. "It's nothing but a cursed relic. No one should wear it." But David didn't listen. The allure of the mask was too strong, its mysteries too tempting to ignore. The shopkeeper's warning fell on deaf ears, and David, fascinated by the mask, bought it. As he handed over the money, the shopkeeper's eyes narrowed, but he said no more. That night, in the comfort of his small apartment, David couldn't stop thinking about the mask. The haunting, lifeless eyes seemed to stare at him from across the room. He tried to distract himself, but it was as if the mask called out to him, beckoning him closer. He finally got up and approached the shelf where it rested, and before he even realized it, his hands were trembling as he took it down. The moment he held it in his hands, he felt a rush of coldness. His heart began to race, but his fingers couldn't seem to release their grip. The mask felt light, too light for something so ancient, almost as if it were waiting for him to put it on. Against his better judgment, David lifted the mask to his face. It slid on easily, as if it were molded to fit him perfectly. But as soon as it settled on his features, a sharp pain shot through his head. His vision blurred, and his entire body felt heavy, as if something was pressing against his chest. A voice, faint at first, whispered in his ear. "Embrace the darkness." He tore at the mask, trying to remove it, but it clung to his face like it had become part of him. His heartbeat quickened, his breath shallow. The whispers grew louder, urging him to give in, to let go. And just when he thought he might collapse from fear, the pain stopped. David fell back onto his bed, gasping for air. He stared at the ceiling, his thoughts racing. What had just happened? Was it a hallucination? Or had the mask truly done something to him? As he stood up to examine himself in the mirror, his reflection was the first sign that something had changed. His face was still his own, but there was a shift in his eyes. They no longer reflected the same warmth, the same kindness that had been a part of him his entire life. Instead, they were cold, dark, like hollow pits, void of any emotion. His pulse raced as he reached up to touch his face. His skin felt unnaturally smooth, his features sharper. He couldn't explain it. The mask hadn't physically changed him, but something had shifted within him. His once gentle nature had begun to feel distant, replaced by a strange, simmering rage that burned in the pit of his stomach. David couldn't understand it. He had no memory of putting the mask on, but here he was, standing before a mirror, feeling different. There was an overwhelming sense of darkness filling him, seeping into his veins, clouding his thoughts. A part of him, deep down, knew that the mask was to blame. Over the next few days, David's personality continued to change. The whispers came more often, their voices getting louder, urging him to act on his newfound anger, to embrace the power that the mask promised. His dreams became twisted, nightmarish visions that made him wake in a cold sweat, his heart hammering in his chest. He began to feel detached from reality, as though he were no longer in control of his own body. The mask had taken root in his mind. One evening, David snapped. He went out for a walk, the mask now permanently on his face, though no one else could see it. As he walked through the streets, he felt like a different person, someone who no longer cared about the consequences of his actions. He began to pick fights, his temper flaring at the slightest provocation. He was no longer the man who had sought peace in the quiet town of Marlow. He had become something else, something dark, something dangerous. He started hearing rumors about a string of violent events that had taken place in the town recently: assaults, thefts, and strange occurrences. It didn't take long for David to realize the connection. The mask was the source of it all. Every time he wore it, his temper flared, his anger intensified. And when he wasn't wearing it, the mask whispered to him, telling him to go further, to do more. The longer he kept it on, the more he felt its grip tightening around his soul. But there was no way to escape it. The mask had become a part of him. It had twisted his mind, and now it controlled him. David was no longer in control of his own actions. The darkness, the anger, the evil, it had taken over, and there was nothing left of the man he once was. The forgotten mask had claimed another victim, and as the town of Marlow fell deeper into chaos, David knew that the mask would continue its curse, seeking out new souls to corrupt, new minds to twist. The evil would never end. The mask, now permanently a part of him, would continue its journey, waiting for the next person foolish enough to put it on. David had been the first in a long line of victims, and the curse would live on, eternally. Story number 8. Imagine a candle that never goes out. No matter how much wind you blow at it, no matter how many times you try to snuff it out, the flame continues to flicker. But this isn't just any candle. It's one that burns with an eerie, unnatural glow, and its flames whisper secrets to those brave enough to listen. This candle isn't just a source of light. It's a beacon for something darker, something ancient. Each time its flame flickers, it calls out to spirits long past, summoning them from the other side. And if you're unlucky enough to light it, you'll soon find that it has a mind of its own. A mind that isn't afraid to reveal the truth of your past, your secrets, and even your darkest fears. But why can't it be extinguished? What happens to those who are foolish enough to try? And more importantly, what is the true cost of inviting the spirits to walk among the living once more? In tonight's tale, we're diving deep into the mystery of the ever-burning candle. A candle that's said to have the power to cross the boundary between life and death, and those who dare to use it may never return. The question is, would you risk everything just to know what's on the other side? So, let me tell you the story of a candle that can't be extinguished and the spirits it calls. A candle that will change everything you thought you knew about the world beyond, and perhaps leave you questioning whether you should have ever lit the flame in the first place. The flickering candle sat in the corner of the room, its flame casting shadows that danced on the cracked walls. It was an ancient thing, old enough to carry the weight of centuries within its wax. Its flame was like no other, a deep, unnaturally steady glow, neither dim nor bright, but always constant. It had been passed down through generations, from one fearful soul to the next, each person wondering how it had come to them, and how they could possibly rid themselves of it. The candle was infamous in the family. It was never to be lit, not even in the darkest of nights, for it was said that once the wick was set aflame, it would burn forever. Its light would not fade. The candle would never extinguish, no matter what you did. But more than that, the stories told of the strange events that followed once the flame was lit. Spirits, restless and angry, would rise from the air, and the candle itself would call them. Despite the warnings, curiosity often got the better of those who found themselves in possession of the cursed object. And so it was that one night, Thomas, a young man who had recently inherited the family estate, came across the candle nestled in an old chest in the attic. He knew the stories. He had heard them from his mother and his grandmother, but they were just stories, old superstitions, and he wasn't one to believe in ghosts or things that go bump in the night. But something about the candle caught his attention. It wasn't just the way it was kept, hidden away in the attic with the rest of the family's forgotten relics. No, there was something about it that seemed to call to him. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, like a whisper at the edge of his mind, a tug in his gut. He didn't know why, but he had to light it. That evening, as the moon rose high above the estate, Thomas found himself in the old sitting room. The fire had long since died out, and only the candle remained to light the room. It sat on the table in front of him, its waxy surface gleaming in the soft glow of the dying embers from the hearth. Without thinking, he struck a match and lit the candle. At first, nothing happened. The flame was soft, unremarkable, just like any other candle. But then, the air grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly as if a chill had settled into the room from some otherworldly place. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch, lengthening unnaturally, as if they were alive. Thomas shook his head, telling himself it was just his imagination. He took a seat in the armchair, trying to relax, but the unease lingered in the air like a thick fog. The candle's flame flickered, and then there was a sound. A whisper, soft at first, like the rustling of wind, but then it grew louder, clearer, as though it were right next to him. He turned quickly, but there was no one there. The room was empty. The candle was still burning, its flame unwavering. He stood up, heart racing. The whispers were growing louder now, swirling around him like voices coming from the walls themselves. "You shouldn't have lit it," they whispered. "You shouldn't have lit it, Thomas." The temperature in the room continued to plummet. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though the very atmosphere had changed. And then the shadows began to move. Not in the way that shadows usually moved with the shifting of light, but in a deliberate, purposeful way. They slithered along the walls, like creatures trying to free themselves from some invisible trap. They twisted, contorted, and then they began to form shapes. Figures, pale and gaunt, emerged from the darkness. At first, they were indistinct, blurry forms that hovered just beyond the candle's light. But as the minutes passed, they grew clearer, more solid. These were no ordinary shadows. These were spirits trapped between worlds, their faces twisted in agony. Thomas felt a chill crawl up his spine as one of the figures stepped forward. It was a woman, her face gaunt and hollow, her eyes wide with sorrow and fear. She reached out with one skeletal hand, her bony fingers inching closer to Thomas, but never touching him. "Help me," she whispered, her voice so faint it could barely be heard above the ever-growing cacophony of whispers around him. "Save me." But as Thomas took a step back, the room grew darker. The candle's flame grew brighter, more intense, casting sharp shadows that seemed to cut through the air. Another figure appeared, a man this time, his face twisted in rage. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and his mouth twisted into a snarl as he reached for Thomas. "No escape," the man hissed. "You cannot leave. The candle has chosen you." Fear gripped Thomas's heart. He tried to blow out the candle, to extinguish the flame that had summoned these vengeful spirits. But no matter how hard he tried, the flame refused to go out. It burned brighter still, the wick crackling as it devoured the air around it. The spirits circled him, their forms becoming more solid with each passing second, their voices rising in a chorus of despair and anger. He ran, but the room seemed to stretch on forever. The door was just a few steps away, but when he reached it, it was as though the distance had doubled. He turned back to look at the candle, now burning fiercely, its light swallowing the room whole. He could feel the weight of the spirits pressing in on him, each one more desperate than the last, their hands reaching for him with a hunger that made his skin crawl. And then, in an instant, the world went dark. The last thing Thomas saw was the candle's flame burning brighter, and the spirits reaching for him. The last thing he heard was the chorus of whispers, their voices all calling out to him, beckoning him to join them. The next morning, the candle was still burning. Its flame was unchanged, flickering steadily in the otherwise silent room. But Thomas was gone. No trace of him remained, no sign, no sound. The candle had claimed him, just as it had claimed all those before him, and it would claim more, as long as it burned. As long as it called out to the living, its whispers would never stop. And so, the candle waits, its flame never dimming, its power ever growing, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to light it, to answer its call. Story number 9. Have you ever stumbled upon something so ordinary, yet so strange, that it sends chills down your spine? What if the fabric of a simple quilt was made from pieces of cloth, each carrying the darkness of its past? A patchwork quilt stitched together from remnants of a cursed history, each thread soaked in sorrow, regret, and untold evil. This quilt doesn't just keep you warm, it holds secrets, and those secrets can haunt you, following you even into your deepest dreams. Tonight, we uncover the mystery of the haunted quilt, a quilt that seems harmless at first glance, but once you sleep beneath it, your life may never be the same. From the moment you lay eyes on it, the unsettling energy begins to build. It's a quilt passed down through generations, each owner dying under strange circumstances. Some say it's cursed, others claim it's the souls of those long gone that linger in the fabric's threads. But no matter who you ask, one thing is certain. Those who possess it find themselves consumed by the spirits of the past. Imagine having this quilt in your home, draped across your bed, warming your body every night. At first, it feels like any other blanket. But then, whispers in the night begin. Strange dreams haunt your sleep, visions of faces you don't recognize, hands reaching out from the dark, and eventually, as the days pass, you begin to see shadows moving in the corners of your eyes, fleeting glimpses of something watching, waiting. You might not notice it at first, but soon enough, you'll realize this quilt is more than just a piece of cloth. It is the keeper of something dark, something ancient, something that has been waiting for you to discover its secrets. So, who will be the next person to feel its curse? Keep watching as we delve deeper into the chilling tale of the haunted quilt, a tale woven in threads of terror. The quilt was discovered under strange circumstances, hidden in the dusty attic of a long-abandoned house that seemed to be waiting for someone to find it. The house had stood silent for decades, its walls whispering secrets, and its creaky floors echoing the weight of forgotten history. No one in the small town knew much about the house or its former owners, but the legend of the haunted quilt began the moment it was uncovered. It was a patchwork quilt, but it wasn't like any quilt anyone had ever seen. The squares were made from different types of fabric, some faded and delicate, others dark, almost as if stained. The materials seemed mismatched, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't belong together. Yet there was a strange beauty in it, a beauty that drew people to it. But the longer someone stared at the quilt, the more unsettling it became. Something wasn't right about it. The fabric seemed to move on its own, as though it was alive, its stitches shifting as if some unseen hand were tugging at the seams. The quilt had a history, and not a pleasant one. It was made from the scraps of cursed cloth, pieces of clothing that had once belonged to people who had met untimely and tragic ends. Each square told a story of sorrow and grief. Some were taken from the clothing of children who had disappeared, never to be seen again. Others came from the garments of those who had been murdered in violent, horrific ways. And a few squares came from clothing found at the sites of unexplained disappearances, where people vanished without a trace, leaving only whispers behind them. But despite its origins, the quilt seemed to hold a kind of magnetism. People who came near it felt drawn to it. They wanted to touch it, to wrap themselves in its warmth. It was almost as if the quilt had a power over them, one that promised comfort while hiding a deep, unspoken darkness. Emma, a young woman new to the town, was the first to bring the quilt into her home. She had heard rumors of the house's haunting past, but she didn't believe in such things. She had moved to the small town for peace and solitude, a break from the chaos of her previous life. And the quilt seemed like the perfect way to give her home a cozy, comforting touch. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. She placed it on her bed, admiring its intricate patterns, unaware of the curse that lay within its fabric. But as the days went by, strange occurrences began to happen. Objects would move by themselves, small things like cups and books that would shift positions overnight. Emma chalked it up to her imagination, or perhaps the house's old foundation causing the objects to shift. But then came the voices. It started subtly at first, a faint whispering in the corners of the room, a soft murmur that she couldn't quite make out. But the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They seemed to come from the quilt itself, as though the fabric was alive, breathing, speaking. The words were unintelligible at first, but eventually Emma began to hear them clearly. They spoke of sorrow and regret, of loss and abandonment. The voices told her that the quilt was not just a piece of cloth. It was a collection of souls trapped within the fabric, longing to be remembered. Emma's dreams grew more vivid, more intense. She dreamed of faces she had never seen, people who were both familiar and foreign at the same time. They would appear in her dreams, their eyes hollow and empty, their faces twisted in agony. They would smile at her, but it was a smile of emptiness, of nothingness. She would wake up in cold sweats, her heart racing, the sound of whispers echoing in her ears. And always the quilt would be there, draped over her bed, its dark presence hanging in the air like a shadow. The deeper Emma delved into the quilt's history, the more she learned of its sinister past. She discovered that every owner of the quilt had met a tragic end. Those who had possessed it had either vanished mysteriously or died in a gruesome manner. And as she researched, Emma began to realize that the quilt had been passed down through generations, each time finding its way to a new person, a new victim, someone whose fate had already been sealed. One evening, Emma was caught in a trance, her fingers running along the quilt's edges, tracing the stitches as if they were calling to her. The quilt seemed to draw her in, its whispers louder now, urging her to come closer, to accept its dark history. But as she reached out to touch it, a cold gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles. The quilt seemed to grow heavier, the fabric shifting and warping, as though something were stirring beneath it. Suddenly, Emma heard footsteps behind her. When she turned, no one was there, but she could feel the presence of someone, or something, watching her. The walls seemed to close in on her, the air growing thick and suffocating. The whispers were no longer in her mind. They were all around her, echoing through the house. They weren't just voices now. They were faces, grim and twisted, their eyes burning with malice. In a panic, Emma tried to flee, but as she moved to leave the room, she felt something pull her back. The quilt had wrapped itself around her, its fabric tightening like a vice. She tried to scream, but her voice was drowned out by the suffocating weight of the quilt. It was as though the quilt had become one with her, absorbing her into its dark, cursed fabric. Emma was trapped, her fate sealed like so many before her. As the days turned into weeks, Emma's presence in the town became a distant memory. She vanished, just like all the others who had encountered the quilt. But people still spoke of her, of the woman who had once lived in the small house with the haunted quilt. Some say they can still hear her whispers in the wind, carried on the breeze. Others claim to see her silhouette, standing at her window, staring out at the world she could no longer be a part of. And the quilt? It remains in that abandoned house, waiting for the next soul to find it, waiting for the next person to fall victim to its dark power. For some things, once they are touched, can never be forgotten. And some things, once they are sewn into the fabric of your life, will never let you go. So, if you ever find yourself in that quiet town, standing in front of a house with a faded for sale sign, beware. Beware the quilt, for it is more than just a collection of fabric. It is a prison for the lost, a reminder that some pieces of the past should never be pieced together. Story number 10. Have you ever felt like something in your life was off? Like you couldn't escape the weight of misfortune no matter what you did? Imagine a single object, a small, seemingly insignificant item, that could bring nothing but bad luck to everyone it touches. Well, that's exactly what happened to a ring, the blackened ring, a cursed piece of jewelry that wreaks havoc on anyone foolish enough to wear it. It all began many years ago when an old, weathered ring was discovered in an abandoned house at the edge of town. At first glance, it seemed like an ordinary piece of jewelry, but there was something undeniably wrong about it. The ring was blackened, its surface marred with strange engravings that no one could decipher. Rumors quickly spread that whoever wore the ring would be cursed, doomed to experience one misfortune after another. The first person to fall victim to the ring was Eleanor, a young woman who didn't believe in curses. She found the ring one afternoon while cleaning out her grandmother's old attic. Intrigued by its appearance and intrigued by the stories surrounding it, she decided to try it on. The moment the ring slid onto her finger, an eerie chill filled the room. Eleanor laughed off the sensation, brushing it aside as a trick of her imagination. Little did she know, that decision would set the stage for a nightmare that would follow her wherever she went. From the moment the ring touched her skin, her life began to spiral into chaos. The first signs were small, mild inconveniences that seemed like bad luck. A spilled drink, a broken shoe, a missed bus. But soon, things took a much darker turn. Eleanor's friends began to get sick, her family members fell into accidents, and her once stable job became a source of constant frustration. Eleanor tried everything to rid herself of the cursed ring. She tossed it in rivers, buried it deep in the earth, and even tried to burn it. But it always found its way back to her. It was as though the blackened ring was bound to her, its evil influence spreading wherever she went. But Eleanor wasn't alone. As the stories of the cursed ring spread, more and more people began to try it on. thinking they could break the curse, thinking they could prove that the ring was nothing more than a superstition. But they, too, soon fell victim to its dark power. Each person who wore it was dragged deeper into misfortune, their lives falling apart in ways that were too horrific to ignore. And still, no one has ever been able to get rid of the blackened ring. To this day, the cursed ring is out there, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to claim it, forever bound to bring disaster to anyone who dares to wear it. What happened to Eleanor? What made this cursed ring so powerful? And will it ever be stopped? Keep watching to uncover the terrifying truth behind the blackened ring and the disastrous fate that awaits anyone who dares to wear it. The blackened ring was never meant to be found. Its dark history was buried in the shadows, forgotten by time, until Eleanor stumbled upon it one fateful afternoon in the attic of her late grandmother's house. She had always been the curious type, so when she found an old, dusty box tucked away behind a stack of forgotten books, she couldn't resist. Inside, amongst various trinkets and old heirlooms, was a ring. It looked ordinary at first, a bit tarnished and worn by age, but something about its cold, blackened surface gave Eleanor pause. It wasn't the sort of ring that you'd wear to a wedding or as part of a fashionable ensemble. No, this ring seemed darker. Its heavy, malevolent aura hung in the air around it. But, being skeptical of superstitions and ancient curses, Eleanor shrugged it off. She slipped the ring onto her finger, feeling a slight chill shoot up her spine. At first, she didn't think much of it, but as she walked down the attic stairs to put the ring on display, she could swear she felt a shift in the atmosphere. As the days went by, Eleanor began to notice something was off. Her once thriving life, filled with laughter and happiness, began to crumble. At first, it was small things, a broken coffee cup, a missed phone call, a delayed train, but soon, the bad luck escalated. The kind of bad luck that follows you everywhere you go. Her car was rear-ended, her job became a nightmare, and her friends began pulling away. She couldn't understand why everything seemed to fall apart after putting the ring on. The ring, despite its ominous aura, seemed to draw her in. Each time she tried to take it off, she felt a compulsion to put it back on. The darkness inside the ring whispered to her, filling her thoughts with desire, confusion, and paranoia. It was as though the ring was the only thing that kept her grounded, even as everything else around her collapsed. It was during one particularly disastrous evening when Eleanor's suspicions turned to dread. She sat alone in her apartment, watching the clock tick away, when suddenly the doorbell rang. She opened the door to find no one there, just a dark envelope on the doorstep. Inside, a letter was scrawled with words she couldn't read clearly, but the tone was unmistakable. The curse was coming for her. The letter had no return address, but it was clear that someone, or something, knew about the ring. The first sign that the ring might be more than just an ordinary piece of jewelry came when Eleanor was at work. She was talking to a colleague when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence and looked at her with an expression of pure fear. "What's that on your finger?" he asked, his voice trembling. Eleanor looked down and saw the ring. It was darker now, blacker than it had ever been before. As if responding to her growing sense of fear, the ring seemed to pulse with energy. Her colleague, visibly shaken, stepped back. "I've heard about that ring," he said. "My grandmother warned me about it. Told me it brings bad luck, misfortune, tragedy." Eleanor laughed it off, but deep inside, she felt an unsettling shiver crawl down her spine. The truth was, she had already noticed how things had gone from bad to worse since she found it. Friends started to call less, her boss grew irritated with her performance, and even strangers seemed to avoid her gaze when she walked past. Soon, the damage became undeniable. Eleanor's best friend was in a car accident. Her father was diagnosed with a severe illness, and her cat disappeared without a trace. The world around her was falling apart, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the ring had something to do with it. She started to do some research, desperate for answers. What she found sent a chill through her bones. The blackened ring wasn't just an old relic. It was a cursed artifact. Legends told of a sorcerer who, centuries ago, had crafted the ring with his own blood, binding it with a powerful curse. The ring's sole purpose was to bring misfortune to anyone who wore it. It had passed from one unfortunate soul to another over the centuries, leaving behind a trail of devastation, grief, and loss. No matter how many times the ring was lost or buried, it always found its way back to the hands of a new victim. And once you wore it, there was no escaping its dark power. It would keep tormenting its wearer until they lost everything: their relationships, their wealth, their health, and ultimately, their sanity. Eleanor couldn't let go. Despite the terror she felt, she continued wearing the ring, convinced that she could somehow reverse the curse. But the more she fought it, the worse things became. Her life descended into chaos. She lost her job, her apartment, and her savings. Desperate, Eleanor began hearing voices in the night, whispers that called her name in the darkness, urging her to embrace the ring's power fully. One night, she went into the forest, hoping that by burying the ring deep underground, she could break the curse once and for all. But as she dug into the cold earth, she felt something, or someone, watching her. When she looked up, there was no one there, but the air grew thick with an oppressive energy. She placed the ring in the soil and tried to walk away. But as she turned, she heard the unmistakable sound of the ring's metal scraping against the ground, as if it was calling her back. The next morning, she woke to find the ring had returned, now resting on her pillow, as though it had never left. In the end, Eleanor realized the painful truth. There was no escaping the blackened ring. It was a part of her now. As long as she wore it, she would continue to be its victim, and her life would forever be marked by disaster. The curse was unbreakable. So, the blackened ring sits, waiting, patiently, in some forgotten attic or dark corner, ready to claim its next victim. If you ever come across it, beware. The ring has no mercy, and once you wear it, you'll never escape its grasp. Thank you for joining us for today's chilling tales. If you enjoyed these stories, please make sure to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to share the video. Your feedback means the world to us. If you want more spine-tingling stories, be sure to subscribe to Muzi Horror World so you never miss our next eerie tale. Stay curious, stay brave, and until next time, sleep tight if you can.